Actually, I have no idea about the range of this mic, and I also have a voice that projects. Can I have a show of hands if the mic is still picking me up? Oh, this is good, because I hate it when you have to stand this close to the mic. So I feel better now. Good. And Peter just gave this great talk, and I wasn't sure, and I didn't pay attention to how close to the mic he was. So, we good to start? Is it time? It's time. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name's Steve Wally. For those of you who don't know who I am, I work for Microsoft. Again, I worked for Microsoft at the height of the fear back in '99 to 2004, and then I left for a dozen years and came back a couple of years ago. I happen to be, through an accident of reorganizations, I live in the Azure office of the CTO. This talk started out because Deb Nicholson said, you should put in a proposal. And I thought, what would this room possibly want to hear from me for? Can I have a show of hands how many lawyers we might have in a room? Wow, that's a small number. Okay, cool. I feel better now. I'm actually, no. I feel better that I am talking to a room full of probably developers and people that live in this space from a business perspective, because lawyers already know what I'm going to say. I didn't mean that to come out that way. But I glibly thought, what would I offer as a topic? And I thought, software freedom in a post-open source world. They'll never accept that. And they did. But really, this is kind of a journey that I've been through over the last 30 years. Anybody that's ever seen me talk in the last couple of years will have seen this slide, because I keep wanting to ground all of our discussions in this. There's nothing new here. I have the strange position of I'm suddenly in my 40th working year. I started working the year they added computer software under copyright law. But I've got stories that I could bore the room with that literally go back to the early 50s, literally back to the first programmable computer in America that von Neumann was working at Princeton in the Institute of Advanced Studies. And you've had this collaborative environment for 30 years, and then they slap copyright on it. And suddenly our collaboration has to change. So we went from kind of this idea of collaboratively developed software being about engineering economics. We build better software together. Linus's law is actually a front-end review law. People looking at the software before you make the commit, not hunting for bugs afterwards, actually builds better software. But then all of a sudden, we ended up with copyright law. And so we have to end up in this space where, collaboratively developed, liberally licensed software is about engineering economics. And so there was this huge number of experiments that started in 1980. How do we keep collaborating when the reality for this is now that we live in this space that we have to deal with copyright law? And there's a certain joy to this. Sorry, I just realized my clock is not running for me, so I can't tell how I'm on time, and I'll have to look over there. So we end up in the space where people start experimenting. And one of the early experiments was the definition of software freedom. I have put up the freedoms because it was a joy at FOSDEM talk on Saturday in a room full of lawyers and free software advocates for somebody to say, how many people can actually list the freedoms? And in a couple of hundred people, like 3 hands went up. So I'm putting them up just to remind us what the freedoms are. But this was articulated in 1985. We had a collection of experiments that started to happen around it. But the thing that I find fascinating about it is even in the articulation of software freedom, it's an outbound thing. There is no requirement for anybody to give back, not even in the GPL. There's a requirement to publish. But this is, when people talk about this as a social contract, we really do mean it as a social contract. We, this group of people collaborating in this community, are sharing our work under copyright with you in this way. There's no requirement to give back. It never has been. It's about an outbound culture of sharing. If you spend any time in this space, sooner or later you'll come across Eric von Hippel's work. I believe he's at Harvard. His work started back in the 80s. And he was basically saying, why do innovators share? And he did a huge amount of work. And the reason it's a sailboarder there, because windsurfer is a trademark, the reason it's a sailboarder is like he did a lot of work in that space. He was dealing with physical things. And what it turned out, there was a whole lot of folks would show up at the beach, with drills and saws and scissors, and they would start hacking the boards. They'd change booms, they'd change sails, they'd change masts. Let's put straps on the board so that when we're going over waves, we can jump. It was a modern culture. And the hackers were changing things. And if anything, the manufacturers kind of stood back because they didn't want to go down this path of manufacturing things that were bad ideas. Instead, they were sitting there watching the hackers on the bleeding edge. And those hackers were only too happy to share. And the reality was they were happy to share because they didn't really have the wherewithal to start a company. They didn't want to sit there and build the next windsurfer brand company. They were happy to be the teachers and the consultants and the branded sports people. They wanted to live on the cutting edge. But that was the thing that interested them. So they were happy to share and share broadly and share widely. At the same time, a lot of these experiments, people working for Microsoft, there was some messaging 20 years ago that said that we were all hobbyists. No. MIT and Project Athena in the early 80s was some of the first work under software copyright. DEC, HP, IBM, and a whole lot of researchers. That was Project Athena. That's where the MIT license came from. It's where the X11 windowing system came from. In Kerberos, it's where the X11 license discussion came from. So this is not something that was kind of idle hobbyists and amateurs. And we saw the work at Berkeley. We saw all of Larry Wall's work in the Perl community and the rise of CPAN. So this is work that was experimented on for almost 20 years. And we ended up in a place where the open source initiative is born. The open source definition is layered on top of all of these experiments to be as inclusive as possible. But at the heart of it, there's still the four freedoms. And at this point, we're now in a world where we have a definition. It's a clean definition. And we start to see the rhetoric in our world change a little bit. And actually, change is not necessarily the right word. We end up in a place where the difference, as articulated by the Free Software Foundation, is one of intent. Now, all of this is still outbound. All of this is still people sharing their work under copyright as an outbound social contract. But in Stallman's writings, he wants to be really, really explicit. Open source, and the open source definition, is about engineers collaborating to write good software. Free software is an ethical choice. It's an ethical mandate on your software. And he's very clear that that's the difference. And for him, it is the ethics of that choice on the software that is the important distinction. I loved it because I remember, and I am happy if anybody can find the reference. I would dearly love it. The freedoms used to be 1, 2, 3, 4. And Tim O'Reilly stood up one day and said, freedom 0 is the right of the creator to apply the license they want. And he was trying to take that definition of software freedom into a broader context, into a societal context, and kind of away from this idea of it's just about the software. And that's when Richard rebased things to freedom 0. And we ended up with 0, 1, 2, 3. But it's that narrowing is actually important. That narrowing is really about ensuring that we're having a discussion about software. We're not having a societal discussion. We're having a discussion about the software. And that's where we need to focus our discussion. One of the first crises we had in the this world, was the fun of software proliferation. Sorry, license proliferation. We used to joke that they were vanity licenses. In the first wave of corporate engagement in the open source community, everybody wanted their own license. And so you had this proliferation of licenses happening. And the problem was, we called them vanity licenses. I suspect it was a point in history where the lawyers were still ramping up. And so in their minds, this was good corporate governance. If we define the license, we know what we mean and how to interpret it. And so it's good corporate legal governance for us to have a license that we publish in this sharing kind of world. So it's a little less than, the harshness of pure vanity licenses. The problem was, because English is such a flexible language, you ended up with small nuanced differences in these licenses that were actually significant. And so it was creating this ever-growing base of licenses that didn't necessarily play well together. And for us as a collection of engineers and business people trying to just do collaborative work, it was becoming impossible. Martin Fink, who's the CTO now at Western Digital, was the CTO at HP and was at HP for a huge number of years through this entire growth of open source and open source licenses, said, if Microsoft had have wanted to win 20 years ago, they should have just put the gas down, just push on the accelerator to create as many licenses as possible. And that just would have fried all of us. We'd never have been able to get any real work done. But we live in a modern world now. I strongly disagree with Andreessen's statement that software is eating the world. We are drowning in software. Software has been democratized. We're drowning in software, and most of it is mediocre, duplicative, and bad. This is the growth in repos. It gets worse. In the last year, we've picked up another 50 million repos on GitHub. So most of the repos don't have licenses. It's not about whether they're OSI approved or not. Most of the repos don't have licenses. Software transmitted disease is on the rise. And so we've also live in a world now where, if anything, the evolution of VCs it's always fun to watch an entire group evolve, and in kind of a business way. So we've now got the VCs hunting for the next big exit on the next big infrastructure play in open source. And most of that is through bad business model design. I'm the guy that continually writes about the fact that there is no open source business model, and people need to stop hunting for it. I've got 2 long essays stuck under that URL. And it's not that you can't run a business on free and open source software. I'm a huge believer in that. I've done it. I'm continuing to try and help Microsoft do it better. And we all have the classic example of Red Hat. The free software definition has never been discriminatory against business. And I think Red Hat is that ultimate proof point. Stallman never said you can't make money. And to him, the money part of the discussion, again, was irrelevant. We were talking about the software when we talked about software freedom. And so you end up with a lot of bad business model design because people think that open source is a business model. We've ended up in a world now, though, where 22 years later, people are now challenging the open source definition. People are struggling. We're living almost on the edge of a post-open source world. And the way we tend to see these debates happen is somebody proposes a new license. It fails. The joy of the open source initiative, regardless of any board politics, the joy of the OSI is they have maintained for 22 years now the public list where licenses are debated. Openly, anybody can join that debate. And so you have this massive experience and expertise base of developers and lawyers who have lived in this space. And it's a growing base of experience, right? As we continue to get better and better at this. that has this very public discussion about, does this license match the OSD? That is the joy of the OSI. But a lot of these new licenses get refused. Means we then challenge the open source definition. It's dated. It's old. It's not keeping up with modernity. I've been working for 40 years. I feel dated and old some days. Of course, the open source definition is now irrelevant. I'm convinced I'm irrelevant some days. The discussions will sometimes bleed into data ethics, and then we end up in the privacy discussion, the sovereignty discussion, and it starts spiraling out of control at that point because we have to change the OSD. It's kind of the hand throw. It's broken. It's old. We need to get rid of it. It needs to evolve. A little bit about my history. I was the engineering manager at a startup for Interix. Interix was the Unix front end on Windows NT back in the 90s. And we started with a license to Windows. It was a very unique license to Windows back in those days. And at the same time, we started with 4.4 BSD Lite, because that's what AT&T's lawyers said we could use. We just had the BSDI lawsuit. Friends were crushed, but we finally had a clear definition of what software we could use. And we started actually with the O'Reilly books, the CD in the back of it. That was the 4.4 BSD Lite manual set. That was our opening bid. But by the time we were shipping product over that next 4 or 5 years, we had on the order of magnitude of, there was 250 to 300 buckets of interesting technology off the World Wide Web, covered by 25 to 30 licenses, some of which still aren't approved by the OSI, that we would take, build into a product that solved customers' problems. How do you move all of your valuable Unix code base over to Windows NT, this new thing? That's the problem we were righteously setting out to solve. And as we wanted people to certainly respect our license, so all of these licenses, the 25 or 30 of them buried in the product, we were certainly adhering to all of those licenses. We were contributing back. We were a group of experienced engineers who understood that you never want to live on a brittle fork. So all of our GCC work went back upstream. We contributed as we had to, we published as we must, and I gotta tell you, the software freedom rhetoric galled us no end, because the Free Software Foundation was the only group that actually had a coherent message before the OSI and the OSD. And so you had Stallman with his ethical absolutism that this was about doing the right thing and had nothing to do with building good software. And as a bunch of engineers, it was like, look, we're doing the right thing. We just can't do it 100%, because some of we as engineers understood build versus buy, and some of the stuff we'd bought. We didn't have the rights to pass it on, and we still had to solve customer problems. So at the end of the day, it was galling to deal with software freedom. So when the OSD came along, it was a breath of fresh air. It was like, oh my God, we finally have a way to talk about this stuff that isn't trying to debate some edge with Richard. And so this was a genuine relief to us that we now had a way as engineers collaborating and sharing to talk about it. So I was never really a free software supporter. I've been accused of being a free software moderate. And I think what that means is I can have a meal with Bradley and Karen and we all get along. I honestly don't know what a free software moderate is. I was just accused of it one day. Oh, you're one of those free software moderates. Open source is clearly one. We now live in a world where the Linux Foundation a few years ago, they did the Kokomo crunch. And yes, I was an engineer. I was an engineering manager. I understand all the problems with lines of code. However, they're an interesting relative measure. The Kokomo crunch that the Linux Foundation did around all of the projects under the auspices of the Linux Foundation said that they had $4 to $5 billion worth of software value under that umbrella. Greg Stein in the Apache Software Foundation, not to be outdone, immediately did the Kokomo crunch on the Apache projects and demonstrated that they had $19 to $20 million of value under their umbrella. And they still, thank you, they still continue to keep track of those numbers in the annual ASF report. But then you have to understand that presumably the Eclipse Foundation can come up with similar numbers. And then you start kind of rolling your way through all the language communities. You look at the Drupal community, the Python community, the rest of the foundations. Like we've won. We have generated tens of billions of dollars. We have co-created that software value. So when I come up against that dissonance of apparently our definitions are no good anymore in a modern world, I have a hard time with that. But it was just recently that as I was preparing for this talk and going back through all of the original writings that came out of the Free Software Foundation, some of O'Reilly's original writings in this space, you realize there's a really important thing here. Copyright was a leap of faith. Sorry, copyleft was a leap of faith. And that was an enormous leap of faith that actually took us to a place where we all took that leap together. As a group of engineers that knew how to collaborate, we became a group of engineers that knew how to collaborate under licensing in a copyright world. The copyleft leap of faith was something we all took. And that to me is the thing that I guess as I start to go through all of these challenges on the open source definition, and I've even heard people start to say that the free software definition and the freedoms are a little long in the tooth at this point. No, I want to throw that challenge back. I want to see people take that leap of faith for their own definitions. I want to see people start to think about how they're going to co-create the next great wave of value. If I want to see the ethical software definition. I want to see the Ethical Software Foundation. Let's take the Hippocratic license and hold it up against the ethical software definition and find out if it matches. Let's, if you want to create a carbon neutral or a carbon negative license, great. And if we have an ethical software definition, let's hold those licenses up to it. Let's hold up the non-military proliferation license. Let's allow this next wave to happen. But let's do it properly. Let's actually take a leap of faith and meet that challenge. If you want to have a discussion about data freedom, then come up with the Free Data Foundation. Have the data freedom definitions. And what are the freedoms that define data freedom? And when I say free data, of course I mean free as in speech and not free as in beer. But it's do the work. Do the work that all of those folks that were the original Free Software Foundation and all of the people that have continued to be part of the Free Software Foundation for 35 years now did. Stand up and do the same thing that we've seen with the open source initiative for 22 years now. Stand up and take that leap. And for all the people moaning on the business side, and there are many a VC, create the business software definition. Go for it. You might even want to create a software business association. My tongue is firmly planted in cheek here for folks that aren't old enough to remember some of that. But when you take this one, when you go down this path, remember that Microsoft created the Shared Source Initiative. And I worked for the company. The first time I worked for the company, I was there for that. It was big. We were a wealthy company. We promulgated the message. It's all about value, software. And we walked away from it. It is dead now. there's still a web page out there and it still points to half a dozen licenses, but it's irrelevant basically, because we're a company that we care about developers. Developers care about open source and open source collaboration and free software, and so we've learned and grown in that direction. So you can go and create a friendly, software business definition, but I would caution you that there are precedents you might want to go study first. And so I want to encourage people in this space, if you really want to challenge the OSD and software freedom and the OSI and the Free Software Foundation, do so, but be bold. Be creative, dare, stand up for your beliefs, go for it. Don't throw toys in my sandbox, because we've generated tens of millions of dollars of co-created software value together as engineers, and we like doing that, and we're continuing to do that. And with that, apparently I have 5 minutes for questions. You.
One question, you mentioned the ethical software definitions could be an approach, and I wonder about the granularity. My question is, could it be like too fine-grained, like something like the ethical engineering definition might be too broad? So can you comment on that?
So the question is, do I have any comments on this idea of an ethical software definition or an ethical engineering definition and how broad or narrow that might be? I think the reason I throw out that challenge is I worry that you are calling the exact problem with it. Thoughtful folks are going to have to go have those discussions and come up with what that definition looks like together, in the same way that, to a certain extent, Stallman said, here are the freedoms, but then over that next short period of time, it became the Free Software Foundation. There was a little more oomph there. And things were debated. And certainly by the time you get to 20 years later, we had lots of experience having these debates. I don't know what an ethical software definition looks like. And I say that because, it's the old, I'm a Canadian living in America, but people joke every time pornography comes up as a discussion. I can't define it, but I'll know it when I see it. And I worry that when we step into the space of ethics, we're walking into the same trap. There was a statement made at the FOSDEM licensing room on Saturday. Do you want your software burning down the planet? Is it okay for Exxon to use your software? And no, none of us want to burn down the planet. But adding field of use restrictions is a very dangerous slope very quickly, both as I understand it from lawyer friends who said, you got to be careful how you do that because you can't easily, but as well from an engineering perspective. And the very people that are willing to burn down planets are the people that are probably least likely to care about any definition we come up with for ethics or licenses. So I think at the end of the day, that's why I'm extraordinarily happy with the software freedom definition and the freedoms, and extraordinarily comfortable living within the OSD as kind of that license implementation of the freedoms. I don't know that there's a better answer, but I'm happy for somebody to go and have that discussion and come up with it. I'm not the person to do it, I know that, so I've kind of self-selected out of that discussion, but I would encourage somebody else to be bold that way. Sorry?
So I want to challenge the comparison to the surfboarders just a little bit.
Sure.
Because I think that there is a useful comparison between the surfboarder culture that was observed in the early days of particular open source software in the 1990s particularly. But one of the interesting things that this comparison leaves out is that when we make surfboards, it doesn't really affect anybody outside of our immediate community. And it's safe to experiment, it's safe to innovate, because you're working within a small, homogeneous, isolated community. But when we write software, that's not the case. We have huge effects downstream on people who have no participation in our community whatsoever.
Absolutely.
And I think that significantly changes the texture of the kind of conversation that we should be having.
That's an excellent observation. I'm just going to kind of report back for the mic, and please correct me if I get it wrong. The observation is when we look at some of von Hippel's early research around, surfboards, you're dealing in a very localized situation. It doesn't have downstream consequences for the rest of society when a group of surfers are modding their board. But when you live in a software context, we can have enormous consequences with what happens with our software downstream. Is that a reasonable? Perfect, thank you. So you're absolutely right. The older I get in this industry, the more I've started to learn to pay attention to how money flows, the economics flow in an industry. And what I mean by that, friend who's well known in this community, Dave Neary, and I were watching a room once. He was at the front of the room trying to encourage folks. We had a lot of telco people at the back of the room, and they were kind of sitting there saying, so when can we use the software? And Dave was trying to encourage that, well, when you participate, I'll just wrap up here, when you participate with us, you could use it sooner. And we thought, oh, what we're really seeing is the difference between engineers that know how to collaborate in a standards context versus engineers that know how to collaborate in a software context. And that was kind of, okay, so that explained most of what we were seeing. But it wasn't until a lawyer who had deeper familiarity with both IT standards, which I've done, and telco standards, which he'd done, and he said, no, what you don't understand is this is how telco standards happen. And he explained a situation that was how patents and money flow in telco. And it flows that way because telcos are sitting there in this massively regulated space where you have to drop down massive capital expenditure to get anything, the next wave of technology out the door, and then you have the cross-border regulatory situation. And so money flows different in R&D in that industry. And bricks and mortar, those costs always get messy. And so I think your observation about surfboards is, that's this very small, world of atoms kind of space as opposed to this very broad software context. But I think you need to pay attention to that whole context to understand how investment flows in it. And this is not about money and greed. This is just how the money flows. To understand how to find those kind of fulcrums to twist a discussion on. And I don't have a good sense of that. I worry that we're stepping into this next space where everything's software-defined everything now, but one of the big things is software-defined networking. And so the telcos are coming, and they're coming into our industry, and I'm trying to figure out how to have this discussion. Because telling them that patents are bad, that's just a language that they can't understand because patent trading is the entire basis of how they do cost recovery in a world that's capital intensive. And so I know that software patents aren't a good thing, but how do I explain it to a telco? How do I explain that to the software engineers who have been weaned in a culture of using patents in software to protect their invention, or the lawyers that have self-selected for decades there? And so I'm trying to find the ways to have those conversations. Your observation's absolutely right, but I think it's one that we need practice in that space, and I don't have it yet.